take a deeper look now at decarbonisation, which is one of the biggest current challenges facing all forms of transportation, potentially one of the most expensive, but also, as we know, one of the most pressing. We're going to be hearing from Liz Bennison, who's the Managing Director for mainland Europe at Arriva, Frederica Claren, who's the Head of Sustainability at Polestar, that's the new electric brand owned by Volvo, and Bronwyn Thornton, who's the Chief Executive of the Walk 21 Foundation, which promotes the oldest form of transport known to humankind, walking. So to each of you, in turn, I want to start by just asking the fundamental question, which is really at the heart of this topic, which is about decarbonisation. Through the pandemic, do you think it has slowed down, or do you think it has sped up on balance? Frederica, can I start with you?
Well, unfortunately, the hopes that we had that we would see a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions during the pandemic as one of the few positive news has really not been, it's something that we see has not happened. There was a report a couple of days ago where they actually see that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased during this year as well. So, of course, we have learned a lot during this year, both on environmental issues. We see a lack of resilience when it comes to systems supporting a sustainable way of living. And that really makes clear that even though we stop traveling and we stop moving about so much, we still don't see any positive effect from that.
Do you think, but I mean, there have been changes, governments in France and Germany have used stimulus measures to promote sales of electric cars. People living in cities have had the experience, probably for the first time in their lives, of waking up and being able to hear birds sing and smell the air, and it smells cleaner, and it gives people a glimpse of what a fully electric future might look like. Do you think there's been any potential benefit from the pandemic? Frederic?
Oh, I thought you asked Liz. Sorry.
No, that was for you, because you were saying that there is still this background noise of increasing emissions that we're seeing. I'm asking positives out of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean the raise in everyday people's awareness around environmental and social issues, of course, has been really clear, and especially, I mean, having cleaner air is so important to everyone, and a result that we have seen so clearly during the pandemic. So we actually have high hopes that this will strengthen, of course, the EV technology and strengthen the business case for that. And then we will see that more consumers do the shift from ICE vehicles to EVs.
Brilliant, thank you, Liz. Can I come to you next? What's your take on whether things have slowed down or sped up during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is it's a bit too early to tell. So I think there's some negative indicators and some positive indicators. I think to Frederica's point there, on the negative side, car traffic in particular is back to where it was pre-pandemic now. In fact, in London, 17% more private cars on the roads than pre the pandemic, which is obviously a negative. But I also do think there's been some real positives as well, and in a number of cities, during the pandemic, we've used some of that road space and given it back to walking, to cycling, etc. And so long as those changes stay permanent, then I think we've made a stride forward. But I think, to me, the Winston quote about never waste a good crisis, I think it's up to us to really decide that now, and whether we make this a positive. And one of the things that I've found amazing over the last 6 months is, as an industry, our ability to affect change very quickly and agilely has been absolutely amazing. We've done things that previously we thought would take years or months, and we've done them in weeks, if not days. If we can just channel that sort of agile transformation capability into this much bigger goal, which is the whole sector, then I'm optimistic, actually, that this could be the pivot needed.
We can't hear
Peter,
you.
Oh, there we go. The cardinal sin of virtual conferences, I was on mute. Bronwyn, I want to come to you. A lot of people, I guess, have started walking a lot more during the pandemic because they've been stuck up at home and allowed out once a day for exercise. How have you seen the changes?
Yeah, so we see the pandemic has had that opportunity, as said just now, that it's provided people with the opportunity to go out and experience their neighborhoods locally and to experience the streets without high volumes and high speed traffic, and to experience the clean air, the birdsong, the joy of letting their children run away from them as they move around in their neighborhoods. And I think perhaps for cycling, albeit we're walking advocates for cycling, the return, this sort of bad normal has been more dramatic because they've lost the road space that they desperately needed. And if you'd asked me in January, what's your best PR campaign for walking, you'd never choose a global pandemic. But in terms of giving us this opportunity to actually roll out some changes, because what we've seen in some of the cities around the world, those that already had plans or intentions or ambitions for increasing walking or provision of good infrastructure for walking have used the pandemic as a catalyst to undertake some of those actions. London's a great example for that. The plans that they've rolled out quickly and effectively have been sitting on the shelf for quite a while. They were ready to go. And in cities like Nairobi in Africa, they had a 20% policy opportunity for investment in walking infrastructure. They just needed the impetus to actually activate that opportunity. And so we've seen those opportunities come through in the pandemic. And we're very keen to hold on to some of those gains, of course, because it's not all of the solutions, but it is part of the solutions and part of the challenge that that we have. And I think the pandemic, I'd like to pick up on the resilience point actually, because it's not just a global pandemic. It was the mortgage crisis in America, the climate actions. We don't build resilient communities if we continue to build environments that are dependent only on private individual car travel, like the vast suburban landscapes of North America and Australia, where I'm from. We're not building in that resilience and those opportunities in our community. And I think this has been a strong lesson. So even if individuals in their own communities are jumping into cars or people are ripe for this change and this opportunities. And so even if our communities are going back to what they know, because that's where their comfort is, governments and agencies have a responsibility to grasp this moment and to build back better, to do things differently and not keep turning around on the old tropes of it'll take too long, or we have to wait for this, or we have to do that.
How do you actually embed changes though? Because people are.
This is my favorite word.
If traffic's going back up,
yeah,
then presumably at the height of the pandemic, at the height of lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, we have to embed the changes, and there's lots of ways to do that. You embed it, just to start right at street level, you embed it in our design guidance. So every time a street is built, it's built for all the modes. It's built for walking, cycling, and vehicle movement. You embed it in the financial instruments we use to fund projects. You embed it in the guiding principles around which those funding decisions are made by government or by development banks, so that when they fund projects, they're funding sustainable transport projects. We can't be spending the billions we spend on road infrastructure without building in sustainability. We can't argue that we've got we can't wait. We can't argue that we can invest all that money in road infrastructure without investing it in public transport and clean technologies and supporting those industries that are doing that. So we have to embed it in the systems and in the decision-making principles, and even right down to little things like removing traffic from around schools. This is not like a maybe it would be nice to have. This is one of those essential things. It's called school streets. It's happening everywhere. It makes them safe. It addresses the air quality issues. It addresses movement issues. And cities and countries and communities can just do this now. Just do it and let the community experience it. So we have to embed it in those principles and not just always think it's too hard or maybe tomorrow. And the UK government's done a good job to put out local travel investment funds. That's good, but it can't be a one-off.
We've already had a couple of questions coming from the audience. Thank you. Do keep those coming into the stage chat box. We'll come to them. I want to ask you particularly how the pandemic has affected your businesses. Obviously, you're two very different lines of work. Liz, going to come to you first. How has the pandemic affected the business for Arriva?
It's not been great, if I'm honest. Effectively what a public transport company does is it moves people around so they can get together, and that's exactly what we've not wanted people to do for the last 6 to 7 months. So I think as an industry we've done a phenomenal job. We've kept our colleagues safe, we've kept passengers safe. Generally we've kept communities moving, we've got key workers to work, etc. So I think, we've been on a massive learning curve for 6 months, and I think from that point of view, we've done an absolutely outstanding job. I think, from a financial point of view and the way the market is constructed, the loss of patronage that we're suffering at the moment, and the projections of the sort of structural change that we think is going to come as we've all got used to working from home, etc., I think is really fundamental for the sector, and really calls into question the commercial basis that we've built the model on. But again, I think that's a great opportunity, because I think we're already starting to touch on this. We've got to build incentives into the system to drive the right behaviour across the entire network. So I think I think this is a really crucial inflection point for us to get this right going forward.
Frederica, how's it affected you? I guess selling electric cars, flagship model we can see sitting right behind you. How have sales of that been?
Well, I mean, of course, this year has been testing us in many ways. And I mean, on a personal level, all co-workers, during spring, we had a very scary situation like everyone else, where we just didn't know anything about the future, the coming months, of course. But being a very young company, being a company with a vision of sustainability and disrupting a system, it has enabled us to be very agile and to tackle these challenges in new ways. So we've actually managed to put this car on the market in a very successful way during this year. So, I mean, I think this year has only reinforced what we're here to do, to do things in a new way, to build a new automotive industry going forward, and to start up a conversation on how we can do things differently in our industry.
Has it helped for electric car sales because people, have an impetus to go green coming out of the pandemic? Or has it actually made it more difficult because currently electric cars are still much more expensive than what we might now call traditional older cars?
I mean, looking at the numbers, we still see an increase when it comes to sales of EVs, which is really nice to see. EVs is only 1% of the global car stock. We still have 2 billion internal combustion engines in the world that needs to be replaced. So we need to speed up the transition. We can't rely on this development that we see that is positive now, because it's going too slow. So something has to happen, something has to change. And of course, during the year, we've seen positive indications from governments, for instance, China, committing to net zero emissions 2060, and the UK ban on petrol cars being moved to 2030. I mean, we've seen strong regulatory moves, of course, that is positive, but we still haven't tapped into the consumer power when it comes to accelerating the transition. We still don't have a clear value that EVs can bring to the consumers. There is so many contradictory messages going around in such a non-transparent way of talking about cars today, that I think that a lot of consumers distrust the industry, and feel a bit perplexed and confused to what we're actually offering. So from Polestar, we really want to become the most transparent car company in the world. We want to actually engage our customers, educate them in what we can offer as an EV, but also production that we need to tackle. and we really want to be honest about that, so that we don't go down the same route as the traditional ICE automotive industry has done for so many decades.
Is it more difficult to invest in future electric technology, which obviously is still at a very investment heavy stage through the pandemic, if your overall finances, and obviously Polestar, you're owned by Volvo, Arriva, you've obviously been hit by the pandemic, has that made it more difficult to invest in some of the future technology? Liz, can I go to you first?
I think it has been a very difficult year. We've had amazing support. We operate across 14 countries in Europe, and we've had amazing support from all the governments actually that have really helped us to keep going throughout this year. But we are, as any company, evaluating what our 5-year plan looks like and where our investment is going to go. And certainly, the pandemic is a factor, and the surety by which the market will rebound and the state in which it will rebound. But I think there already are a lot of parameters built in that are encouraging us to think greener as we reinvest. So many of the countries that we operate in have already got guardrails in place. This is when you should buy the last diesel bus. This is when the last diesel bus will be on the road. So we've got a number of those. We benefit from having a cleaner fleet, and that's not always electric. That could just be a less polluting diesel bus as well. I think they've still got an important role to play in all of this. But I think if the industry together, and by the industry I mean everything, through private cars, through walking, cycling, and companies like ourselves, I think got to come together to really create the vision of how we do this in a sustainable way going forward, so that we have the confidence to invest because we've got policies behind us, we've got the support of the industry, to know that if we are investing in electric or we're investing in hydrogen or whatever, there is the longevity there. For us to get the returns that we need, but also for us to put in the extra effort around both the investment and also innovation, which I also think is really important.
You mentioned the last diesel bus. Can I ask you for your prediction when you will make your last?
It's different. It's different. Yeah, it's very different country by country. So if you even just taking the whole of Europe, let alone the rest of the world as well. We work with countries like the Netherlands, which actually that day is coming very, very fast now. So we have a contract in the south of the Netherlands in Limburg, and we have committed to carbon neutral on that contract by 2026. So we are, rapidly replacing the fleet with electric fleet. But again, we're also much more so things like cycles, things like mobility as a service, to decarbonise the network, not just the fleet. And I think that's a really important part. We can race towards decarbonising the fleets of buses and the trains and so on, but we've got to look at that network and think about the entire sustainability of that network. How do we encourage people to, take their private car but park it well outside of the city and then use mass transit to get into the city, and hopefully, for the last couple of months they use a bike or they walk or any other option that's out there. But I think this calls for a degree of coordination across the broadest definition of the sector that we've not really had before.
I want to come back to, yes, I was going to come to Bronwyn on this, which is the question of, can actual policymakers and city authorities actually including walking in kind of recommended ways to get around, and particularly ways to link up transit stops or car parking to bus stations or whatever. Are you seeing a shift of people actually starting to, include this in the modes of transport?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really interesting with this particular thing is very often and mostly people join walking and cycling and call us active or non-motorized or something like this. But actually at Walk 21, we see public transport as our stronger partner because they extend the walking journey that you start at your front door. And then we enable the entire ecosystem. So commuter catchments transport systems are wising up to this. The Washington Metro did the work a few years ago to analyze their financial modeling and all of their different stations. And their decision was to invest in safe walking and cycling access to stations to underpin the fiscal viability of their service. They found that for every 10 houses they connected by walking to the station, increased their ridership by 7 rides per week. So it also reduced their paratransit costs in terms of their people with the disability transit movement costs. And so what we're seeing, that model is now being reflected, like in Sydney with their new metro, they're doing commuter catchments. So when we invest in our public transport service, it's not just the track or the bus or the street, it's the whole area around it, and prioritising walking and cycling. You don't have to build car parks. I know car parks are revenue streams for the system, so I understand the give and take here all the time, but the ridership value of embedding public transport into our cities, improving the walkable catchments around the stations and stops. It's a really strong financial model proven by Washington, being invested in Sydney, and in Melbourne, where they didn't do it with their new systems. They've actually done the analysis and recognised the cost loss, the loss that they're making, or the unrealised savings as a result of not investing in catchments. So the research is there around the value of building these things in to the public transport system, not just into the technology.
Bronwyn, can I ask you?
I agree with you
So go on.
put cars in parking lots and not utilize them. I mean, that is also a challenge going forward, to really build a more resilient community where you have an ecosystem of transport modalities that is constantly being utilized. Cars stand on the side of the curb 96% of the time. So yeah, I agree with you. I really would love for us to move away from building huge car parks, keep them in use instead.
Bronwyn, can I ask you about, there's obviously lots of new technologies, lots of new ways of getting around coming into cities. We're seeing e-scooters. We're going to be talking to an e-scooter company later on. You're seeing, pavements becoming more cluttered as electric charging points are put in for people who don't have driveways. Are you worried that these new things are actually making walking around more difficult?
Sometimes they are. Yes, sometimes, especially if these mobility devices are using pedestrian space, they're using footpaths, they scare older people, they are risky and they're clutter when they're left behind, but they're not the real problem. They are actually part of the solution, and we need to recognize that. So we need to embrace these new opportunities. These light mobility modes is what we call them. But they need their own space, just like bicycles need their own space in the system. So it's an allocation of space. That's a priority. That's a choice about how we design our cities and how we choose to use to prioritize most of that space to heavy vehicle movement. Then we are going to see them as problematic in the people space. But once we reallocate that space and and that reallocation can be on time, it can be on, sort of vehicle management, freight deliveries. It's not just passenger movement, but freight movements, which impact on the quality of our space and things. So we embrace these modes as part of the agenda for shifting the whole mobility ecosystem in our cities. And one of the other hats I wear, just quickly, is I work with the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Partnership. And that's a global body designed to work very closely on the climate change agenda and the Decarbonisation Transport Alliance. And it's looking very strongly at this. And the interesting thing is that countries are not investing in transport solutions as part of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And so we need to actually not just argue amongst ourselves about what the best way to allocate space in the city, but electrification, public transport, walking and cycling need to push upwards inside their countries to get national ministers to see the value in committing to these solutions in their commitments under those targets. This combination of the oldest mode in the world and the bright new buttons on the block. We have to do all of it, and we have to do it all quickly. So we have to find the most efficient ways of doing that.
Great. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions come in. Thank you for those. Keep them coming. We're going to go to some of those now. standard of walkable cities?
People love to ask me this question. On numbers alone, Hong Kong wins on numbers because they have an integrated public transportation system. It doesn't win on quality, but it wins on percentage of people who walk every day. Barcelona is pushing pretty hard to become the most brilliant walkable city with their super blocks program, with their commitment to public space and movement and things like that. So they've always been fantastic. And we held our conference in there years ago, and it continues to be a groundbreaking event, groundbreaking city, challenging everyone to think differently about how they be. And we heard from Paris earlier. Paris, of course, is Anne Hidalgo just got re-elected on an agenda that changes the way we imagine our cities. And so Paris, of course, is a beautiful city architecturally as well as walkably. So these are some of the highlights in Europe. And I mean, Singapore also is very walkable, but it's so variable across the city. So it's a combination of things. And there is no single golden goose here for sure.
Great. Well, there we go. Paris, Barcelona, Singapore, and Hong Kong, if you're looking for a post-pandemic relocation to a more walkable city. A question coming in. How does the panel feel about young commuters? How do young commuters and commuters of the future feel about future mobility? Frederica, maybe I'll come to you on this first, and then we'll go around everybody else.
More alternatives than the previous generations. We have to move away from the thinking that there's only one option for everything, one option for transportation, one option for energy sources, the food you eat. And I think that especially millennials and Gen Z are really open to having a dynamic way of living and choosing the option that is best for the day, you know. So, and that's really interesting for us, of course, to see how can we promote that through sharing services, for instance. So, yeah, I think they're more open and flexible.
Brilliant. Liz?
Yeah, I think it's one of these, I hate to sort of generalise with, you know, sort of millennials do this and millennials do that. So I'm conscious of trying to avoid that. But you know what, I do think the green agenda is a much stronger influence on decision making generally, the younger you get. So I think that's really important. But I also think there's two sort of critical things about that demographic. One is they are digital natives. So absolutely rely on technology to make decisions about how they travel, when they travel, etc. And I think as a sector, public transport in particular has been quite poor at digitalising. You know, if you compare it to retail or banking or whatever, it's a long way behind at the moment. And I think that's where some of the investment needs to go. And I also think they are more susceptible and more likely to make decisions based on. I think they're generally more demanding of the services they consume. And again, I think public transport and probably mobility generally has been a bit slow on the uptake around customer experience. You know, I think I'm in one of the few sectors now where generally our contracts don't reward us for good passenger experience. It's just not part of the construct at all. And name another industry where that's part of your commercial proposition. So I think they're a really important, if we're going to affect big behavioural change, which is what we need to do to enable modal shift, then I think that demographic's a really important part of it.
Do you see that change, the move, you know, to get a in the contracts and the way that you actually fulfil them, to have to, you know, take into account whether people enjoy the journeys or not?
Yeah, I mean, London's has done quite a lot around that. There is a factor on the contract. There's a bonus on the contract for good. So they poll people, and we get paid based on that. So again, it dramatically varies country to country. But I just don't think generally the industry has put the effort into really understanding, you know, why people travel with us, why they make the choices that they do. And how they feel about the whole thing. And you know, to me, if we're going to affect this massive transformation, which we need to do over the next, 5-10 years maximum, we've got to change behaviour. And how do you change behaviour? It's two sides. It's a carrot and a stick. And I think we've looked at car, but I think we've also got to really reduce the convenience deficit. Still the simplest thing to do is to walk out your house, jump in your car and travel to your destination in your car. And we've got to unpack that and make it more and more convenient and pleasant to do that journey in a different way. And I think those two things, digital and customer experience, are going to become much, much bigger topics in the sector.
Yeah. Bronwyn, what do you think the future consumers want from mobility?
I think it's complicated by a couple of things, and I endorse what my previous speakers have already said about this group around digitalization. And the other factor I'd like to throw in here is uncertainty. They're definitely committed to green agendas, but their futures are much more uncertain, I feel, and as the parent of several, their lives are shifting quickly. They're making choices that have this sort of dimension of uncertainty in it. And so one of those uncertainties is financial uncertainty. So they don't own anything. They don't want to own anything. We had an attic full of stuff to give them when they moved out, but they don't want any of it. They don't see ownership in the same way. And so car sharing, mobility services, walking, so these sorts of modes are much more appealing to them because it keeps them lightweight. It keeps them able to respond to circumstance. And what I feel and hear again in my work is there's this uncertainty, but also can do so many different things. And that lightweight approach is all part of that. They're also frustrated. They want to be buying the technology that's right for the planet, like the electric cars, but it's not within reach yet. And so they're ambitious around those things. And I see that very much playing out in the choices that they're making about where they live, and how they move around.
I remember, Polestar's parent company Volvo ran an advert for its new subscription service for its cars under the strapline "You used to buy music too" as well, which I thought was very, very clever way of thinking about it. Frederica, can I come to you? We've had a question on Polestar specifically. Is Polestar going to be offering its own sharing platform? And is it going to connect with public transport in the future in order to accelerate this transition to shared zero-emission mobility?
Well, we are here to accelerate the shift into sustainable mobility. So that is kind of our scope. But we also see that we have a lot of affiliates that we can work with in order to expand solutions for the sharing economy. So we don't have to do everything ourselves. We're going to be expert in building this car in a sustainable way and securing that it's charged and used in a sustainable way. But within our group, the Gilo Volvo group, we have a lot of interesting affiliates that we can collaborate as well. For instance, the example that you just brought up, the mobility service M. So, I mean, we see the need for collaboration a lot, and that you should be open to collaboration as a company, and that could lead to more results on sustainability than if you choose to go about everything yourself.
Great, thank you. We've had another question coming about electric cars. Again, I say there's a lot of electric car questions. All of the people asking these questions should come to next week's Future of the Car Summit as well, where we'll go into this in a lot more detail over 3 days, if I can give that event yet another plug. This is probably a question for you again, Frederica. Look, as people have to try and charge their cars, particularly if they're charging them at home, do you see a general shift towards lighter and more efficient cars so that people can charge them using domestic chargers rather than being reliant on fast charging infrastructure? Now, obviously, your car behind you is a big, large battery, serious machine. But do you see a shift towards smaller cars that are faster to charge?
We see a need for everyone to be able to drive an EV. Who needs a car? Who doesn't want to or can use their feet or the public transport? So there needs to be car around to enable everyone to see, of course, a link between the environmental performance of a car and the weight. So that is an issue that we are working on a lot. But we don't see a tendency right now due to the charging situation. I mean, I've been driving electric for 8 years now, and I've never had any issues charging, regardless if it's been a small car or a large car. They are so efficient. I've never been hindered. I've driven to Italy and the mountains in Sweden. That there is really, we really have to change the mindsets of consumers and really assure them that this is a system that works today and that is really convenient, and there's no problem in charging from home. Just as long as you're buying green energy, I'm good.
Liz, how do you deal with the issue of charging fleets? Because presumably when you have electric buses, if you charge them all in overnight together, you're going to have localized blackouts in the grid. So how do you deal with this whole question?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is still emerging as well. You know, the industry's experience of running large-scale electric fleets is still relatively small and a short window of time. Obviously, places like China have got much bigger volumes and more experience than we've got here in Europe at the moment. And it is a bit horses for courses. So we don't just have depot charging. We have other charging mechanisms where the buses can charge during the day as well. And we're learning really about how to deploy that in different, there's a different setup for a rural environment to an urban environment in terms of what works. And also, the technology is changing dramatically. For every year we get, some different thoughts around what the technology is going to be like, and have to start to figure that into the broader plans. We're working with an amazing UK bus company at the moment that are trying to be really the Tesla of the bus world. And rather than sort of starting with a diesel bus and converting it into electric, they've started from the use cases. We need to move 30 or 40 people around at once. What would you do? What would you build around those 30 or 40 people to be able to move them? And the product that they're bringing to market is going to look, quite different to what people are used to for a bus. But far more importantly, it's going to be a lot lighter, so it's going to need charging less frequently. It's going to be able to use smaller batteries and so on. And they're the kind of things that make me very optimistic about this, because I think we are getting to the point now where the technology is getting better than our vision almost. And it's really about how quickly we can embrace that and take it on board. I think we'll solve all these problems, and in 10 years, nobody will ask us a question about charging infrastructure anymore, because it'll just be a given.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Bronwyn, can I ask you a question specifically about walking? Obviously, the electric cars, they have lots of data around that. Buses, you can work out how much they're worth to kind of economic value of walking to, societies as a whole.
Yes, of course there is. Because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it can't be done. And you have to look beyond the immediacy of the moment, of the product or the purpose. And so some of those economic values around walking, let me start a different place. If you're setting up a retail opportunity, what's the first thing you count? Footfall past the front door. So when shopping centres are selling space inside their shopping centres, what are they selling? They're selling footfall, they're selling ambience, they're selling this whole environment around it. And that's the same with walking. When you actually start to measure the impacts of walking, we've got measures very well established around the impacts and the benefits for people's health, the impacts on people's mental health. I've talked already about the value of walking for the public transport systems, and also the economic value for our streets, especially in England, which has such a rich urban fabric of high streets and local shops. And it's only, in fact, people on foot spend more in those local shops than people in vehicles. And so those investments in public space, which support walking, the retail and the property value impact of those can be measured and valued as part of that walking ecosystem. And the other way that you can measure walking is the savings that you're realizing. So that if you have energy savings or carbon reductions, whether it's through mode shift or through air pollution quality levels, drops all of these things can be measured and valued and built into models. In fact, we did a really interesting project in Europe a couple of years ago where we looked at congestion, because that's the big problem we have to solve. But congestion was only perceived as a single, private motor vehicle issue and its impact on freight movements. And when we look at that as a multimodal approach, where you include walking and cycling within the same corridor and you look at capacity rather than congestion, then you change the modeling, the way that you think about what we measure and what we value in our transport systems. Then the value of walking flies up the agenda, and the investment becomes an imperative to support those things. And that project illustrated it. And we built some of those instruments to capture those broader benefits in the cost-benefit analysis modeling that we did. It's more complicated, but it's possible happening.
Are there any cities or governments that actually, monetarily incentivize walking? So if you take a trip that you otherwise would have taken in a car, you get credit or money back or something like that.
Yeah, so there's local reward schemes that do this type of thing. So mostly around sort of local shopping. So they did this in Budapest, and where if you walk to your local shops and you demonstrate that, then you get some reward points which you can spend then within those local shopping contexts. So it comes in combination with local. And there's a range of apps and programs on the market which reward you for your mobility choices through a range of point accumulation, like frequent flyers or any of those other things as well. So, and the technology is there for that, because we all have tracking devices now that can measure whether we're walking or cycling or how we're traveling, and those rewards can come in. So the models are there. It's just the choice to apply it to this context.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've had another question come in about the type of energy that we put into electric vehicles. If it's not 100% renewable, then are we really actually improving the situation, or are we just pushing the problem elsewhere? Liz, I want to come to you on this, and then to Frederica.
I think it's a really good question. We absolutely strive to source green energy, wherever we can. It's not always possible, but it's certainly an ambition of ours.
So looking at the different phases of the life cycle of an EV, if you look at the user phase, we've done a complete life cycle assessment of the car behind me and compared it to a comparable ICE. And regardless if it's charged with the global electricity mix or the European or wind power, it still has a lower footprint over the life cycle than a comparable ICE. So it is a better option on the whole, if you look at the way that we have assessed it. If the user decides to charge with renewable energy, they can almost half the carbon footprint of the car over its life cycle compared to the global mix. So it's a huge difference, but still, if you charge with the global mix, it still outperforms an ICE over the lifetime.
And has that analysis looked at things such as sourcing the rare earth materials that go into the batteries, and the big question we still don't know very much about, which is what you do with the battery at the end of its life?
Yes, so what we've done during the last year actually is that we've done a full life cycle assessment of Polestar 2, developing a methodology behind that, because there is very little standardization and harmonization on methodology. So we've had to put in a lot of work, and we've done that together with Volvo. So we've been able to do it in a way that other OEMs could do it as well. Because we see a huge issue today that you can't compare different life cycle assessments because OEMs are not transparent on the methodology. So what was the question, Pete? Once again.
It was both whether the production of the battery, so the rare earth materials and the mining that goes into it, and the recycling of the battery at the end of its life, how they fit into the car's overall carbon footprint.
Yeah, we've included all that in our methodology. And of course, we still don't have measured data in all but we've been able to use generic data that gives us a really good indication. Going forward, we will develop this, of course, a lot, trying to find even clearer data so that we can come really close in the analysis. So we have included all that.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Liz, Bronwyn, Frederica, thank you so much for your thoughts there. Fascinating, lots to think about there. Thank you too for your questions. After the break, we're going to be looking at innovation and disruption. A session will be hosted by the FT's technology correspondent, Tim Bradshaw. After that, we'll be hearing from the Chief Executive of Heathrow about the future of airports. I'll be back at 4:20 when we'll be talking to Hitachi. Still to come, we're hearing from the World Bank and Spin. So lots more to come this afternoon. We'll see you after the break. Thanks very much.